It is a tale as old as time that every failure is a step to success. And in the mid-1990s, during the largest boom in portable computers in the 20th century, this would be the next step. Quite literally, as that was the name of a whole new computing environment that was gaining recognition in relatively niche tech circles. NextStep. It may just seem like one of many software projects that were popping up at this time, but this was a venture that was invented and personally backed by none other than Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple. Despite its failure, this software was directly behind the creation of things you've definitely heard of, such as the game Doom and even the World Wide Web. And chances are, you are even using this software right now. It was a product from Jobs' new company, Next Computer, which he founded after his tumultuous exit from Apple in 1985. Following much tension, falling sales, and calculated business politics, Apple pointed the finger at him. So Jobs created Next Computer to take over an untouched sector of the computer market, as well as regain his control over the industry. As you could have gathered from the beginning, the Next Computer did not sell well, and its operating system was discontinued. But its legacy, and even its very components, still live on, with much of their innovative features being directly repurposed into the incredible technology we take for granted today. But that does seem a bit contradictory. How could Next, a company which was revered as being so ahead of its time by its contemporary users, end up a failure? Moreover, how could that failure still power so much of our technological infrastructure today? What is the story of Next Computer, and what made its contributions so special?
Getting the most out of your Next Computer also involves taking good care of it. It's just like taking care of yourself. You try new activities, you keep things healthy, and of course, you stay away from the more dangerous areas. And with the net making the rounds, that involves a new concept called cybersecurity. Thankfully, we already have the tools for this in NextStep, and it's called Try Hack Me. Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. If you want to truly combat hacking and cybercrime, you have to be a bit of a hacker yourself. This is known as ethical hacking, and it effectively allows you to use a hacker's secret weapon against them. Try Hack Me's course on offensive security teaches exactly this. And if I use NextStep's web browser, its wonderful user interface, I can do an ethical hacking simulation. Here we are hacking into the Spanx web application, and Try Hack Me keeps everything within the browser. No installation necessary. Its learning environment is so flexible. If you make any mistakes or break anything, you can always just reset the simulation and start over, allowing you to get as close as possible to real-life application of your knowledge. And you can always ask Try Hack Me's virtual assistant Echo for help if you get stuck on anything. Now, if I open our machine's terminal and use the derb command, followed by our bank's address, I can essentially brute force the website into showing hidden web pages. Wow. I'm gonna have to stop there though. It is up to you to figure out the rest. Let me know in the comments if you figure it out. Because with Try Hack Me's guided learning paths and gamified motivation, you can even earn certifications and even be prepared for interviews in cybersecurity roles to get you one step closer into the tech industry. Join the 6 million other people using Try Hack Me by using the link in the description. See how far you get with offensive security. Many rooms are free, but if you use the code SQUID25, you can get full access and 25% off your annual subscription. Of course, we are ethical hackers here. As the crickets once said, I fought the law and law won. Thank you for tuning in to this NextStep presentation.
I was recently talking to a friend who is a professional computer engineer, and the topic of Next actually came up in a conversation, and he very humorously summed up the entire thing as Steve Jobs' crash out era. This is a totally accurate description, and it's what I think makes this whole tale so interesting. Although Next ended up being very influential, it was kind of formed on a whim, at least in the sense that Jobs would have likely never done something like it at that time had he not been ousted at Apple. And that's when our story truly begins. In 1984. Apple's flagship product, the Apple II, was still going strong. Despite its initial launch in 1977, the Apple II helped make the company nearly $1 billion in sales in the 1983 fiscal year alone. That's how revolutionary it was. But Apple wanted to do something even better, both in technological innovation as well as public image. They wanted to show that they were more than just a utilitarian and nerdy computer company. They were the computer for everybody. This prompted Jobs to hire on John Sculley as the new CEO of Apple. Sculley at the time was the CEO of Pepsi. Jobs particularly loved Sculley for his incredible marketing work, with one of his most notable campaigns being the Pepsi Challenge from 1975, which significantly boosted Pepsi sales. Naturally, Jobs wanted the same for Apple. And so this is where we get that old chestnut about Jobs famously saying to Sculley, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world?" Of course, this appeal to the masses would also require making the computer easy enough to use for someone who had never used one before. Rather than having this intimidating command line environment that practically requires learning a whole new language to perform tasks, what if you could instead just click a button? This was known as a graphical user interface, or GUI for short, and Apple was inspired by niche products from Xerox to implement it in their own work. Although their initial attempts at incorporating it were not successful, they were not ready to give up just yet. So at the start of 1984, Apple was teasing what they believed would be their greatest product yet: the computer to change all computers.
We shall prevail.
They called it the Macintosh, and the computer had never been easier. Now, I've already done an entire video about the Macintosh, so I will keep things brief here for the sake of time. But even though it looked really ahead of its time, the Macintosh was not a success. The long and short of it is that it was crazy expensive, and it couldn't really do much. And this was reflected in Apple's overall profit in 1984, which was now at a decline. And by 1985, things got even worse. Feelings of animosity between Jobs and Sculley were brewing, particularly due to differing management styles, as well as shifting blame for who was truly responsible for the failure of the Macintosh. Jobs was convinced that the Macintosh failed because Sculley decided to up its price by another $500. And Sculley felt that Jobs' vision for the computer was too ambitious and, frankly, unrealistic. Having a very high advertising budget and low price for a computer of this magnitude and complexity back in 1985 was just not commercially viable. And with the failure of Macintosh's predecessor, the Lisa, a pattern was starting to show. The board ultimately sided with Sculley, which ended with Jobs being ousted from the company. Apple insisted that Jobs had quit, while Jobs insisted that he was fired. Which is it? Well, it was both. Jobs had been removed from his leading position on the Macintosh project and was essentially demoted to a really crappy position at Apple that didn't really have any power or responsibility. This is basically a tamer version of what we call a constructive dismissal, where a supervisor doesn't directly fire an employee, but makes their job so boring or miserable that the employee feels compelled to quit. To spare himself the humiliation, Jobs did just that. He sold all of his Apple stock except for one single share to keep as a memento and left the very company that he started. But of course, Jobs didn't go out alone. You could say that the business politics within Apple at this time was quite polarizing. The company was essentially divided into Team Jobs and Team Sculley. Much of Jobs' team worked with him on the Macintosh and Lisa projects, and they essentially all formed a mutiny and went with him to work at his new company. Because that's what the question was. Now that Steve Jobs and his team were out of Apple, what was next? That was a word that really stood out to Steve Jobs, not just because it represented this uncertain, transitionary point in his life, but because the word itself seemed to hold a lot of power in the computer world. It all started after a phone call with his friend, Tom Suter. Jobs was originally going to call this company 2, since this would be his second company. But Suter had talked about a tech conference he attended in Seattle where the presenter kept saying the word next during his speeches, and it really stood out to him. Turned out, that speaker was Bill Gates. But of course, Jobs didn't know this at the time. It was also a great word for representing what Jobs thought would be the next generation of computers. He felt that these machines were not exercising their full potential and capability, even for the time. What particularly stood out to him was just how archaic and not very intuitive even some of the mainframes a lot of large companies were using at this time were, particularly universities, research institutions, and even government agencies. Now, why would Steve Jobs suddenly start targeting this demographic after spending almost a decade making computers for everyday individuals? Well, these companies had a lot of money. So making a computer that's much more expensive than what the average person can afford is not as big of an issue. But it was not just that. Targeting these institutions would still allow these machines to gain adequate exposure to more ordinary people who would otherwise not be able to afford purchasing them. For example, if a university with a huge research budget buys one of these machines, everyday research students can now access them for free whenever they're on campus and see all the incredible and powerful things it can do. It's a very smart approach, as it effectively would let Jobs make the computer that he wanted to make, like the Macintosh, but without the logistical problems that came with it. It would truly be the next step into the information age. But what features was the next computer going to have? This was a question that Jobs and his employees spent the next 18 months figuring out, over the course of multiple company-sponsored retreats. These retreats were even caught on video, and it really captures a candid look at the brainstorming process between Jobs and his team. In fact, much of Jobs' personality pops out in these clips, where he is often straightforward, no nonsense, and even at times abrasive.
But, I agree that let me back up a bit.
So somebody's got to say, here's what we can do, and we can make it happen, and here's the level of thing we can ship in 16 months. And what I hear him saying is, well, anything more than a Port of Mac author, forget it. And boy, that just makes me smoke. Fuck everything after shipment. Just look to shipment. You know, marketing's out of line. There's too many people in marketing. Well, George, I can't change the world, you know. What do you want me to do? What's the solution this time?
But you see, what we can learn is
what I want is probably irrelevant.
When the vision for the Next was finally mapped out, it featured an array of concepts that were quite innovative for its time. In 1988, all this work would eventually lead to the creation of their first computer model, and arguably the most iconic one in retrospect. It was nicknamed the Cube. This was a machine that was going to be incredible in every way, even cosmetically. It boasted a minimalist yet unique and quite futuristic looking design, coated in a beautiful matte black. This especially made it stand out from the other computers of the time, which were often this ugly beige color that screamed office job and doing complicated work. You know, boring stuff. Yuck. Who wants to think about that? But the choice to incorporate black into the Next computer was very deliberate, because this had a much more advanced, cool look to it that was much more exciting and inviting. I would even argue that this design still holds up well today, even the CRT monitor. But just the casing itself feels very much like some custom builds you can find nowadays. But the computer's internal features were special as well. Next was one of the first machines to incorporate built-in Ethernet support. This made it much easier to connect to a desired network without needing additional peripherals. And of course, arguably one of its most signature and beloved features was its sound system. It included a digital signal processor that operated at 25 megahertz and had up to 96 kilobytes of memory. In other words, it was pretty much state-of-the-art for its time, and allowed for it to appropriately support programs like MusicKit, which allowed for users, such as musicians, to digitally create their own MIDI-style music. And the best part, it only cost $6,500. Oh, in 1988 money. Yeah, as you would have guessed, the NeXT computer did not sell well, and its exorbitant price was a big part of it, despite the company's vision of targeting large companies rather than people. But it wasn't just that. Despite its great features, it still had its share of limitations. For one, the computer worked only in black and white. Now, of course, support for color monitors on computers certainly did exist at the time, but there were several reasons for why this decision was made. First off, color displays used a lot more memory, up to 8 times the amount of memory, depending on how many colors it could show. Additionally, many color displays at the time had pretty bad resolution. Now, you could get away with this when displaying images. In fact, images could often look better. This is a big reason why a lot of gaming setups of the time supported color. However, with a much more professional setup like the NeXT, where things like text are to be a lot more expected, resolution was key. In fact, Jobs really wanted high resolution to even be a selling point of NeXT. This is because one prominent feature of the NeXT was something known as WYSIWYG, an acronym for what you see is what you get. And it means what it sounds like. The appearance of what you are creating on screen is exactly how it will look in the final outcome. In other words, rather than doing something like creating a program or document through super complicated coding and command line environments, you can just click and drag buttons and text to quite literally create how you want that environment to look when it's finished. One of the most innovative examples of this that NeXT included was its new program, Interface Builder, where you could do just that. Drag and drop elements on a screen to create a program, rather than only having to work with text. WYSIWYG environments would obviously be much more agreeable to a high-resolution screen, and black and white printing was still the standard in 1988, so the trade-off didn't seem that big. For all these reasons, the NeXT computer was monochrome. But of course, as technology got better, this would change, and future NeXT models like the NeXT Station would support color in 1990. But even then, the NeXT just didn't have that much software support for other programs that were already very popular at the time, at least not enough support to justify its high price. And so, NeXT stopped building machines altogether in 1993, focusing exclusively on outsourcing their software. Because the company's software would not go unnoticed for long. In fact, its eventual recognition and appreciation would not only keep the company afloat, but would last for decades. What was no doubt the greatest feature of all in the NeXT computer was its operating system called NextStep. Because these machines were supercomputers, they of course needed a super operating system. And what kinds of systems did supercomputers traditionally use at the time? Ones that were built with Unix. After all, it was a kernel that had already been regularly used by many institutions for a couple of decades now. This meant that it had seen a lot of revisions since then, and had become much more flexible, as well as robust and stable compared to other systems of the time. So NeXT naturally wanted the same thing. But they decided to do something quite unique in the process. They created their OS with a hybrid, combining both the Mach and BSD kernels. Created at Carnegie Mellon University, Mach is considered by many historians to be one of the first ever true microkernels. What this means is that the kernel only provides the most basic services, such as scheduling, memory management, and so on. Everything else, like file systems and drivers, run at the user level. Pretty much all systems at the time were monolithic, meaning that everything ran in the kernel level. This means that if you're on a microkernel system and are running a program that suddenly stops responding, it is way less likely to take the whole system down with it. On the monolithic system, it would always crash. This made microkernels way more stable to use as a result, and NextStep combined this with the BSD kernel because it was Unix-like and had support for virtually all Unix services. So now you had a system that was not only incredibly stable compared to its contemporaries, but was Unix-like enough for the open group to declare it as Unix certified. So now it was, in fact, Unix. This great stability allowed NextStep so much wiggle room to really push the boundaries in software development. This included something that would probably be the most revolutionary and remembered feature that Next had to offer: object-oriented programming, or OOP. In the old days of programming, the larger and more complex your project got, the messier and more disorganized things would get. This made it much more likely for bugs to show up, and for overall program stability to decrease. With object-oriented programming, code can be much more organized and categorized into things called classes or objects. For example, if someone wanted to build 2 cars, they could just start their second car using the car class, which may already include car-like things such as the wheel and windows and so on. This is much easier than just building the second car entirely from scratch. This is what object-oriented programming did, by providing a pre-made blueprint-style setup, saving users time, headache, and even potential error. Although OOP wasn't invented by Next, what was really cool was that it was heavily incorporated into NextStep's native programming language, Objective-C. This, along with Interface Builder's WYSIWYG environment known as OpenStep, made programming with Objective-C much easier, and helped significantly popularize it later down the line. As mentioned at the beginning, Next would go on to be used by Tim Berners-Lee to create the World Wide Web. This great setup allowed for Next computers to also really dive deep into the growing technology of 3D graphics. In fact, Jobs in general was already really fascinated by this technology, even at this time buying a company from George Lucas known as the Computer Graphics Group, with the name eventually changing to Pixar. Funnily enough, Pixar did not use NextStep, but instead Solaris OS on Sun and SparkStation computers. This was primarily because by the time Jobs bought the company, Pixar's entire workflow was already so heavily intertwined into these systems. Switching would take a long time. And for the ambitious projects they were working on, like Toy Story, this wasn't exactly practical yet. In fact, you could say that a lot of companies at the time had this opinion on NextStep. It was very good and beloved by the fraction of people who used it, but there just wasn't a ton of software support for it. And companies were so used to the systems they already had, and switching over would just be too costly. NextStep was just too late, and companies had really no use for it, except for Apple, the company that had fired Next's founder 10 years prior. In the mid-90s, Apple was not doing well at all. They were basically creating just failed products and watered-down, less exciting versions of the original 1984 Macintosh that weren't really capable of much. Even Apple's first Unix-based system from 1988 was still incredibly outdated and not well supported at this time. And on top of that, it was very uninspired, often feeling just as utilitarian as the companies it was making fun of a decade before. Compared to the massive popularity and innovations of Windows 95 and NT, it was no contest. It wasn't even clear that Apple would survive the start of the 21st century. They were bleeding money. They needed something to save them. They needed Steve Jobs. Although NextStep wasn't popular, Apple saw all the incredible things it could do, and they saw the incredible things Jobs was doing with the company as well as Pixar. Scully was already out of Apple, and realizing that they were ultimately wrong about Jobs, they wanted him back. And so, in 1996, Apple bought Next for $428 million, giving them full rights to NextStep. Now, why would Apple spend so much on an OS that really wasn't that popular? Well, they felt that incorporating NextStep's incredible features into the Macintosh platform would save them and make them once again a legitimate competitor of Windows. And also, they weren't just buying Next, they were buying Steve Jobs. and that comes at a very large price. He would return as interim CEO, and with the massively successful launch of the iMac, his first project since returning, he then became permanent CEO. Apple was now back on track, with the iMac even becoming the #1 selling computer in the United States. While they were flourishing, they wanted to strike the iron while it was still hot, and basically create a whole new macOS using the NextStep foundation. They had just released macOS 9, so they decided to give this overhaul system the succeeding and coincidentally very punchy name macOS 10. It was the first macOS to use a system called Darwin, which was derived from NextStep, basically the skeleton of the OS. But even so, it still directly took many popular features from NextStep, such as the dock, system-wide drag and drop, applications using the .app extension, the preview app, and the dreaded beach ball of doom. It would also include Interface Builder, which would eventually become Xcode, and would continue to use Objective-C, bringing it further into the spotlight. This was all encased in a beautiful new design known as Aqua. By adopting Mac's software support, as well as leading to the creation of some incredible software suites, all accompanied by advancing computer hardware, NextStep was finally able to become the OS it always wanted to be. It was reborn through macOS 10, and its features are still alive and going strong to this day. In 2000, Steve Jobs said that he wanted macOS 10 to be Mac's operating system over the next 20 years. And ultimately, he was right. If you would like to learn more about the history of the Macintosh, you can find my video on it right here, as well as related videos down below. A special thanks to my Patreon supporters. Check out patreon.com/nationsquid for ad-free access and exclusive interactive content. You can always buy me a coffee, too. Thank you for watching, everyone.